They started cropping up 3 years ago after the financial crisis, signs about John Galt and Atlas Shrugged. For some, Ayn Rand's famous novel and its hero offer a roadmap.
I believe Ayn Rand, especially Atlas Shrugged, has the answer for the problems we're having in this country today.
Among those inspired by Rand's writing, vice presidential candidate Paul Ryan.
The reason I got involved in public service, by and large, if I had to credit one thinker, one person, it would be Ayn Rand.
But who was she?
Ayn Rand was a Russian-born Jewish intellectual. She was the product of a totalitarian culture who developed a fervid sense of individualism and individual rights.
Biographer Ann Heller says Rand was a teenager when the Communist Army seized her father's pharmacy.
The Red soldiers marched in, shuttered the doors, put a red banner across the door, and her father never worked again, and she was there to see that humiliation.
She came to the U.S. in 1926 and soon became fearful of what she saw. The New Deal, Social Security, big government getting bigger.
She saw American communism begin to blossom, or so she thought, in the 1930s, and was appalled and horrified.
Her most famous books, The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged, paint an ugly picture of big government and celebrate the individual over the collective. She called her philosophy objectivism, which values selfishness, rejects altruism, and advocates complete free market capitalism, as she told Mike Wallace in a 1959 interview.
I'm challenging the moral code of altruism, the precept that man's moral duty is to live for others. I say that man is entitled to his own happiness and that he must achieve it himself.
In Ayn Rand's eyes, what was the role of government?
Very, very, very small. No public schools, no public libraries, no public hospitals, no public roads.
What's the biggest misperception of Ayn Rand?
I think the biggest misperception is that she's against things, that she's against government.
Dr. Onkar Gate is the senior fellow at the Ayn Rand Institute. He says her philosophy resonates in a particular way today.
Because she asked people to rethink what the purpose of government is. As a result of this financial crisis and what the government did in response.
So she would have hated the bailout of Wall Street, the bailout of the auto industry?
Yes, she was opposed to handouts for anybody and everybody, including businesses.
Author Gary Weiss thinks Rand's views can be seen most strongly in efforts by some conservatives to cut back on social programs.
She made it sort of morally justifiable to be really harsh in your treatment of the poor.
So what would happen to people in her ideal society that cannot help themselves?
Who would take care of them would be friends, families. They'll do it out of a sense of benevolence, out of a sense of generosity.
But not out of a sense of religious duty. Rand was an avowed atheist.
She thought that Christianity and communism were two sides of the same coin.
Which may be why, more recently, Paul Ryan has stepped back from what he said in 2005.
I grew up reading Ayn Rand, and it taught me quite a bit about who I am and what my value systems are and what my beliefs are. That's what I tell people. Everybody does their soul searching and trying to find out who they are and what they believe, and you learn about yourself. I grew up reading Ayn Rand, and it taught me quite a bit about who I am and what my value systems are and what my beliefs are. It inspired me so much that it's required reading in my office for all my interns and my staff. We start with Atlas Shrugged. People tell me I need to start with Fountainhead, then go to Atlas Shrugged. There's a big debate about that when we go to Fountainhead, but then we move on, and we require Mises and Hayek as well. But the reason I got involved in public service, by and large, if I had to credit one thinker, one person, it would be Ayn Rand. And the fight we are in here, make no mistake about it, is a fight of individualism versus collectivism. And when you look at the 20th century experiment with collectivism, that Ayn Rand, more than anybody else, did such a good job of articulating the pitfalls of statism and collectivism. You can't find another thinker or writer who did a better job of describing and laying out the moral case for capitalism than Ayn Rand. It's so important that we go back to our roots to look at Ayn Rand's vision, her writings, to see what our undergrounding principles are.
One of the principal achievements of this country in the past 20 years particularly, I think most people agree, is the gradual growth of social protective legislation based on the principle that we are our brother's keepers. How do you feel about the political trends of the United States, the Western world?
The way everybody feels, except more consciously. I feel that it is terrible, that you see destruction all around you, and that you are moving toward disaster until and unless all those welfare state conceptions have been reversed and rejected. It is precisely these trends which are bringing the world to disaster, because we are now moving towards complete collectivism or socialism, a system under which everybody is enslaved to everybody. And now what is self-sacrifice?
Yes, what is self-sacrifice? You say that you do not like the altruism by which we live. You like a certain kind of Ayn Randist selfishness.
I would say that I don't like is too weak a word. I consider it evil. And self-sacrifice is the precept that man needs to serve others in order to justify his existence, that his moral duty is to serve others. That is what most people believe today.
Well, yes, we're taught to feel concerned for our fellow man, to feel responsible for his welfare, to feel that we are, as religious people might put it, children under God and responsible one for the other. Now, why do you rebel? What's wrong with this philosophy?
But that is what, in fact, makes man a sacrificial animal. That man must work for others, concern himself with others, or be responsible for them. That is the role of a sacrificial object. I say that man is entitled to his own happiness and that he must achieve it himself, but that he cannot demand that others give up their lives to make him happy. And nor should he wish to sacrifice himself for the happiness of others. I hold that man should have self-esteem.
And cannot man have self-esteem if he loves his fellow man? What's wrong with loving your fellow man? Christ, every important moral leader in man's history, has taught us that we should love one another. Why, then, is this kind of love, in your mind, immoral?
It is immoral if it is a love placed above oneself. It is more than immoral, it's impossible. Because when you are asked to love everybody indiscriminately, that is, to love people without any standard, to love them regardless of the fact of whether they have any value or virtue, you are asked to love nobody.
Merit, talent, intelligence, hard work, or investment strategies. It has to do with the fact that some folks had a head start. And that head start doesn't go away just because you pass the Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, Fair Housing Act. In fact, let's understand the real basis of that head start, because this is clearly something some people are confused about right now. Particularly these folks who keep yelling and screaming about how they don't want the government intervening in the economy. And they don't want the government intervening in healthcare, and they don't want the government managing. They just want the market to control everything. They just want small government. See, that's precious to me. Coming from people who never objected to big government when it was creating white wealth, when it was creating the white middle class. Make no mistake, that is what did it. Wasn't hard work and initiative in some vacuum, because most people in a competitive society have to work hard or they sink. So that sort of goes without saying. White, black, brown, doesn't matter. People tend to work hard and do so in relatively similar numbers. But what did matter is that the government of the United States stepped in and created wealth for white folks. Big government did that. We need to understand that's where the Head Start comes from. And this thing goes back an awful long ways. Actually, it goes back to the colonies in the 1630s and 1640s. There was a program in place. My family actually took advantage of it when one of the branches came during that period. You may or may not have heard about it. Odds are not, because we don't talk about it in school. But it was this thing called the Head Right program. The Head Right program was a program that allowed male heads of household from England who came to the United States to claim 50 acres of land and the tools with which to work it for nothing, just for making the trip. Now, you see, you give out 50 acres of land and some tools to black people, and we call that a handout. We call that welfare. We might even call that reparations. You give out 50 acres of land and some tools to white folks, we call it nation building. See how that works? It's fascinating, the different kind of rhetoric that we use. Millions of acres of land were given out that way over a period of a very short period of time. Fast forward to the 1860s. Homestead Act of 1862 gets passed. What does it do? Gives out 240 million or more acres of land for virtually nothing to white families. People of color almost completely barred from being able to take advantage of it. 240 million acres of virtually free land. The free market can't do that. Let's just at least agree on that. The small government can't do that. The market cannot take other people's land and give it to you. Right? Only a very large government with guns is capable of doing that. And that's what happened, of course, because this had been somebody else's land before, and then it got taken and redistributed. And yet what's interesting is I haven't seen a single one of the families, because there are 20 million white folks in this country today, some estimate as many as 50 million, but at least 20 million, who are the direct descendants of those people who got Homestead Act benefits, many millions of them living on that land, living on those ranches, living on those farms, living in those houses. Not one of them has showed up in Washington, D.C. and said, you know what, I got to give this back, because it seems to me that if I keep this property that the government made possible, that'd be like, what would that be like? What's the word? That'd be like socialism. So here, y'all can take this back, because I didn't get it fair and square, you see, but no one does that. Fast forward to the 20th century, not even the early 20th, the middle. So we're talking about the lifetimes of people in this room, and for others of you, certainly the lifetimes of your parents and grandparents. Right? From the 1930s until the 1960s, the first 30 years of the Federal Housing Administration Home Loan Program, add to that the VA Home Loan Program, added to that in the 1940s. What were these? These were government-created programs to subsidize indirectly by way of guaranteeing with taxpayer dollars private loans from banks. Prior to the creation of the FHA, banks would not lend money to working-class people. Didn't matter what color you were. They just didn't want to do it because the risk was too great. So even if you were white, didn't matter. If you didn't have enough to pay like half the down payment up front and you could pay it off in 10 years, you weren't getting a mortgage. That was the way it was. The government steps, so there was no middle class. I mean, there just wasn't any. The government steps in, creates the FHA program, later the VA program. What do these do? They basically say, don't worry, if the borrowers default, right, it'll be backed up by the full faith and credit of the United States Treasury, which is to say the taxpayers of the United States. So you'll get your money back, or at least some portion of it. And that made the banks willing to lend to lower income and working class white families who previously would have had to rent, just like black and brown families that wouldn't have been able to buy. But the problem was the FHA, which now is like a universal, a lot of you when you get your first home will probably get an FHA loan. That's what you do. It's low interest, the terms are good, you don't have to have a lot down, that kind of thing. But in the first 30 years of that program, it was almost exclusively for whites. Because the underwriting criteria that the banks were using that was actually given to them by a quasi-public institution, right, known as the Home Ownership Lending Corporation, which was created during this period. The underwriting criteria that they used basically made it impossible for people of color to get these loans, even though they were guaranteed with taxpayer money, including the money of black and brown taxpayers. But the way the criteria was written, 98% of all the loans went to white families. By 1960, 40% of all white family mortgages were being written under this one preferential policy. Government policy, $120 billion worth of housing equity loaned from the early 1940s, late 30s until the early 1960s, at a time when people of color couldn't get in on that. $120 billion head start. And again, if you do that for people of color, that's affirmative action, that's racial preference, that's welfare, that's a handout. You do it for white folks, it's good macroeconomic policy. Right? And of course, it was good macroeconomic policy. It would have been even better had it been extended to people of color, because you'd have had an even bigger economic stimulus, but they weren't thinking in those terms. So you have the FHA, the VA program, even black and brown veterans excluded from the loans that were available under the VA program. You have the GI Bill, which in theory was available to all returning veterans after World War II in Korea, but in practice, the disproportionate benefits went to white veterans, because if you were a veteran of color, the employers, because theoretically what the GI Bill did, it said you could get training, to have a job, you could go to college, you get these opportunities, but the employers still had the right of refusal. They still had the right to not hire you, to discriminate against you on the basis of race. Their property rights as owners were given precedence over the right of those returning GIs to have jobs. You couldn't just go to any college if they didn't want to admit you, so people of color were still excluded even after they had served the country in the military. So you had all of these programs, Homestead Act, VA, FHA, GI Bill, go all the way back to the head right system, all these things pumping literally hundreds of billions, one might say trillions of dollars worth of wealth into white folks' hands before people of color even got to the starting gate of wealth accumulation by the time the Fair Housing Act came around. And if you know anything about the Fair Housing Act, which wasn't even passed until 1968, you know that for the first 20 years, neither Democrats or Republicans thought it was important to put enforcement mechanisms in. So there weren't even any enforcement mechanisms until 88. Right? I mean, so 20 years, it's on the books, but it doesn't mean anything. And even now, we know that there's evidence of discrimination. I'll speak to that in a second. But the point here being, that's why I find it so interesting when those folks in the Tea Parties and all this stuff that are angry about healthcare talk about they want their country back the way it used to be when government was small. What date was that? Because government was never small for white people. Never was it small. Taxes were not lower back in the day. Top tax rate in 1958 was 91%. It's less than half that now. Whether you think it should be even lower, let's not pretend that we want to go back to the way it was when taxes were low. Taxes were higher, government was just as big, and white folks didn't mind it when we were the only ones getting benefits. It was only when people of color started to gain access to other programs, which aren't even as generous as the ones we had access to, that all of a sudden we discovered our inner libertarian. Right? All of a sudden we discovered our inner love of the free market. We didn't care about that before, right? When the New Deal was passed, people of color were excluded from almost all the programs. Social Security for the first 20 years basically excluded 8 out of 10 black folk because it said you couldn't get in on Social Security if you were an agricultural laborer or a domestic worker, which was like 3/4, 80% of all black folks in the country. And that was done at the behest of Southern Democrats who made FDR work that into the New Deal legislation in order for them to vote for it. They just want to make sure black folks couldn't get in on the government programs. They didn't mind government programs. They just didn't want people of color getting in on it.
Politicians. Number 5. James L. Hart, Tennessee, believer in eugenics. In 2004, Hart won the Republican primary in Tennessee, vowing that if elected he would work toward keeping less favored races from reproducing or immigrating to the United States. In campaign literature, Hart contends that poverty genes threaten to turn the United States into one big Detroit. When I knock on a door and say white children deserve the same rights as everybody else, the enthusiastic response is truly amazing, he said. Fortunately, he lost the general election. Number 4. John McCain, no friend to Asians. During the 2004 presidential election, Senator John McCain told a group of reporters on his campaign bus, "I hated the gooks. I will hate them as long as I live." Gook is a derogatory term used against Asians. Although McCain later said he was referring specifically to his prison guards and not all Asians, many Asian Americans took offense. McCain refused to apologize. Despite the Gook's remark, McCain was still considered a serious candidate in that election. And ironically, he was not soundly defeated by Bush until the Bush campaign leveled their own race baiting at him, claiming his adopted daughter was actually the love child of an adulterous affair he had with a black woman. Number 3. Robert Byrd, pre-transformation. Shortly after his death, the late Robert Byrd's personal story was told as one of great transformation. He did, later in life, become a champion of civil rights. However, during the early part of his career, he was an unabashed bigot and member of the Ku Klux Klan. Byrd was a Democrat. I am a former colleague of the Ku Klux Klan in Raleigh County and the adjoining counties of the state. The Klan is needed today as never before, and I am anxious to see its rebirth here in West Virginia, Byrd said. In eulogizing Byrd, former President Bill Clinton made this explanation of Byrd's history with the KKK. He once had a fleeting association with the Ku Klux Klan. What does that mean? I'll tell you what it means. He was a country boy from the hills and hollows of West Virginia. He was trying to get elected. And maybe he did some things he should not have done. But he spent the rest of his life making up for it. That's what a good person does. There are no perfect people, and there are certainly no perfect politicians. Number 2. Jim Raghead Knotts. In the 2010 South Carolina Republican primary, Knotts calls his political rival Nikki Haley and President Obama ragheads. "We've already got a raghead in the White House. We don't need another raghead in the governor's mansion," Knotts said. He later apologized for the slur, saying he made it in jest. Haley won that primary. Number 1. Jesse Helms, unabashed racist. Jesse Helms was the last unabashed racist politician in this country. His ascension to Congress was largely due to his willingness to pick at the scab of slavery and segregation, and to inflame racial resentment against African Americans. There have likely been many racists after him, but he was the last to stake his political career on it. Back in 1984, a reporter summed up Helms' Senate campaign. "Racial epithets and standing in school doors are no longer fashionable," the reporter wrote, but 1984 proved that the ugly politics of race are alive and well. Helms is their master. Helms launched a filibuster blocking a bill that would make Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday a national holiday. Helms' campaign literature warned repeatedly about black voter registration drives. On election eve, he accused his opponent of being supported by homosexuals, the labor union bosses, and the crooks. In 1990, in an election against African-American Harvey Gantt, Helms aired an ad, "You needed the job and you were the best qualified." But they had to give it to a minority because of a racial quota. Thank you for